Another spotlight on Title IX, 50 years on, and we're pleased to be joined by retired athletic director Debbie Lazorik. How's life in the slow lane, by the way?
I have to tell you, it's a good thing. I loved what I did in my 40-year career, but I'm loving this next piece of retirement.
Good. That's good. So I thought you were going to say the slow lane's really fast, but that's what you hear sometimes. So for the sake of demarcating 50 years, and you and I are about the same age, so what we'll do is break it down into our youth, what we remember maybe, and then kind of talk it out beyond that to your coaching and your athletic director. So let's go back to 72. I think it's crazy to think of that politically. The country was probably as divisive then as it is now. And I don't even see anything in between now and then that was more divisive politically, right? Because
it was a different time than Nixon. I was just getting ready to graduate high school, 72. Yeah. I graduated in 73 from high school. And I grew up in Gary, Indiana. So you had, coming out of the 60s, the riots, Grant Park, all of that I grew up around. So yes, from a political standpoint, actually things were starting to calm a little bit. Like I said, I was getting ready in a year to go off to college. We had no girls athletics as we know. It was called GAA. I think most women from that era would be familiar with that, Girls Athletic Association. And you did intramurals. My senior year in high school, which would have been 72, 73, Title IX passed in 72, they had the first ever intrascholastic team. And I can remember playing three schools, Griffith, Indiana, Hobart, Indiana, and Hammond, Indiana. And we just thought that was the most special thing that we actually had a uniform. And we played teams from other schools, just like the boys did, right? We went to all the boys' games, but we never had the opportunity to experience that until my senior year in high school.
Was it intramural then at the grade school level? Or, I mean, how did you gain your skills over the course of that time?
The fallacy that most people have about, and I'm going to say this is more on a personal note.
Right.
I was not an athlete. I have a career in intercollegiate athletics. I didn't have those opportunities. There were no girls' sports. I didn't grow up playing sports. We played intramurals. I went to a college that had no women's sports. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a background as a competitive athlete per se, as you might think of a person who had a career in athletics, because the opportunities were not there. So if Title IX passed in 72, as we know, laws just don't. It's not like the seatbelt law. Everybody just didn't jump on board and say, let's go do what we have to do to make it right. So it took, obviously, years for Title IX to really show its impact. So I really didn't grow up playing sports like we would know our girls play today.
Something else we have in common, because I peaked athletically at about age 7, so that works.
I'm waiting for my peak right now.
So
at 67.
Where did your interest come from? I mean,
actually, I had gone to school with no women's sports. I went there to have my undergrad degree is in social work. In my senior year in college, they hired, and I don't know who would recognize this name, but Gordy Gillespie, who's in 13 Hall of Fames. He coached Rudy, they hired Gordy away from Lewis University to come to St. Francis, a small little college in Joliet, and Gordy started women's basketball and volleyball. And I got to work in his office as my student job, and he looked at me and he said, we're going to let you be on the team.
That's quite a mentorship to look back on.
Gordy Gillespie was the most dynamic, significant, other than my family, person in my life to this day. So I got to play on his team. My senior year, we played DePaul, Northwestern, traveled in station wagons, and I got to sit next to him in the passenger seat because I was a senior. So he said, what are you going to do, Debbie, when you graduate? I said, I'm going to school at Southern Illinois in social psychology. I'm going to get my master's. And he looked at me and he said, you have to be a coach. And I looked at him like, Coach, I didn't even get to play half the time. No, and we're going to hire you full time. We're going to send you to get your master's degree at George, which is now Aurora University. At that time, it was George Williams. And I got my master's degree in administration. And I worked full-time right next to Gordy Gillespie for 3 years, and I became the assistant to the women's athletic director because they had separate departments
Sure.
back then.
Yeah.
Got to teach a class, did some admission work, and then decided after 3 years I was ready to make a move, and I applied to a place I'd never heard of, Marietta College.
Wow, how about that? And we'll meet Debbie Lazorik, Coach Debbie Lazorik, when we come back. We'll take a little break. We are celebrating 50 years on Title IX and the anniversary thereof, and we'll be back with more right after this. Johnny Wharff along with Debbie Lazorik, and Coach Debbie Lazorik. We'll start there because it's a good segue, and even though we didn't do it on purpose. But so somebody has to ask you, first of all. Yep, there's got to be an interest. Somebody has to ask you to do it or tell you should do it, and then you have to say yes. Mm-hmm. So there's 3 big steps to the process of a career, right?
Yes.
So kind of work us through that a little bit.
So I obviously took the path of going into athletics, did my education part of it, and just soaked in everything I could learn. Those 3 years at St. Francis, decided to move on, and like everybody does at 25 years old, you were sending your resume everywhere that looked close. Marietta College had an ad in the NCAA news that said head volleyball coach, instructor. That's all it said. Didn't say anything about basketball. Mm-hmm. I threw my resume in there because I was an assistant at St. Francis those 3 years in volleyball and basketball. Right. Came back, and I thought, I'm not moving to Ohio. I grew up in Indiana. I went to school, lived in Illinois. They all look the same. I'm not going to Ohio, but I'll go for the interview. So I drive down here for the interview, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Southern Ohio, and looks nothing like Northern. And then the college was beautiful. I like the East Coast. I've always enjoyed the history of the East Coast. And I thought, this looks just like an East Coast college. So I interviewed. Obviously, I was offered the position. I accepted it. And I came in August of 1980 to be the head volleyball and head basketball coach and an instructor in physical education. At that time, they had a full major in physical education. Even though I have no degrees in physical education, right. They charged me with developing a major in recreation management because I had done some work in recreation during the summers when I lived in Joliet, and then my master's was in business. So I developed a major at that time in recreation management and recreation programming, and I was on a tenure track position. Myself and Coach Shally were the only 2 to ever have tenure track positions, which means you have to take your classroom work extremely seriously to earn tenure.
Who's the AD?
Phil Roach. So
yeah.
I was hired by Phil Roach. I always say I was hired by 3 people. Phil Roach, the athletics director, Mary Jo Herdman, who just recently passed away, as the department chair, and Bill Wetzel, who had just transitioned to be he was the intramural director. And those were sort of the 3 in the athletics department that I interviewed with.
Give me the, kind of in a nutshell, what the women's sports program at Marietta College circa 1980
It was pretty bad. And when I say bad, it obviously, Title IX had not found its way to Marietta. Right. And I had come from a pretty successful women's program at St. Francis. They really devoted. We had the basic volleyball, basketball, softball. Field hockey was big. The rosters were not full. We did not have practice uniforms. We did not have, and we had no assistants. We had no support in terms of statistics, no support to set up for game day. I look back on it, I call it welcome to Division III. Because if you didn't, and you were in women's athletics, if you didn't do it, it wasn't going to get done.
Did you feel like it was your charge then at that, or to some level? Obviously, you're young and you're new and you're stepping in. Sure.
Yeah. And honestly, we're naive.
Yeah.
Nobody educated me on Title IX in 1980. So, you just stepped in and you did what you had to do to make sure that the athletes you were coaching, the women in that case, were getting the best experience they could. But it looked significantly different. I wasn't even allowed to use the main basketball court to practice on. They wouldn't let me because I only had 7 players on my first basketball team. I had to go to the dean to get permission to use the court.
So you were coming here for volleyball, and then they said, "Oh, and by the way, this."
Well, when I interviewed, they added basketball too, which actually was probably because Gordy coached the women for 2 years to make sure they would get off to a good start. So I was able to be mentored from a basketball perspective from Gordy. So I probably felt that was more my strength at that time. And then I would sit with Coach Wetzel. He and I always talked X's and O's. I would sit with Coach Roach. He and I always talked X's and O's. Coach Shawley and I talked recruiting. I went up. He pulled out his metal drawers and his little card files. What I did know was that what I didn't know, I knew that. Debbie, you don't know a whole lot.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not coming out of a background of athletics.
Right.
So I had a lot to learn, and I was willing to learn it from, as I reflect back, some of the best.
Yeah, and it becomes then the extended part of your career,
Yes.
which we'll talk about in a moment, and that would be moving on into the athletic directorship. I think of Ben, who's producing this program upstairs right now, for him to say, we need you to do an air shift. And oh, by the way, you're also going to be the program director, so you step in, but then you learn, and obviously at some point, hopefully appreciate it and move on to, if it's your passion.
I wouldn't. Like most of us, we've had opportunities to do other things, and I chose to stay here for 40 years.
Oh, it's fantastic. Debbie Lazorik is our guest, and we are celebrating Title IX 50 years on, and we'll be back and chat with her about the next phase of her career right after this. Johnny Wharff, pleased to be joined by Debbie Lazorik, a retired athletic director at Marietta College, and we've moved into that phase in our discussion. By the way, that photo that I dropped down there in front of you, if we're going to say circa late 50s, probably?
Yes.
And is that,
I would say
what
early
would you,
60s.
Well before our time, but what would you just assume is
Looking at the clothes, that always is a giveaway too.
all the boys have the crew cuts.
Yep.
It's a softball game at the old.
It's old Timlin Field, and I would say we've got intramural girls softball.
Yeah. No helmets.
No helmets. The shoes. Hope she didn't trip running the bases. Yeah.
That's probably what you came into uniform-wise, right?
I was going to say,
a little bit better.
Actually, I thought, gosh, is Gene Arbuckle back there somewhere?
That's funny. So becoming an athletic director, and I'm going to try to. I was, if you can be good friends with an older person. When I was in high school here, it was Violet LeClaire for me. Because I was on the newspaper staff, and I was the editor of the newspaper at a very young age. And so all the work would be done out at their house in Glendale Extension, right?
Yeah,
so the paste ups and all these crazy things that people don't do anymore, darkroom photography. But she was an every woman to me in terms of Kool-Aid trays and cookies, and you guys get your work done. So it probably didn't dawn on me, and I think she just passed last year.
Yes, a year
But it didn't dawn on me that what a pioneering spirit she was as it relates to this, right?
Yes, no question. Vi and Mary Jo were my mentors. I've lost both my mentors in the past year.
And Mary Jo Herdman.
Yes, Mary Jo Herdman. Vi was women. So when I arrived, Vi was women's athletics. One person.
Okay.
One person was women's athletics. She was coaching field hockey. She had done basketball.
Yeah.
She had done tennis. Back then we all coached 2 and 3 sports. And I coached 3 sports for a number of years too. Vi was women's athletics. And the beauty of Vi, and she and I shared an office space. So I saw her every morning. She could have gotten beat by 20 in field hockey, and Vi came in with a smile on her face, so you knew her.
Yeah.
High energy, always positive, and she always started the day off with a joke, and the students loved her. She approached everything the way in which you knew Vi, which was a smile on her face, high energy, and Deb, let's just go. Okay, we lost, and it was about providing those women the best experience they could have.
Yeah.
And I learned, because I came from I struggled. I didn't win a game my first year as a head coach. Right. When they look at my career record, I always say, well, do we have to count like the first 5 years?
Yeah.
That didn't bother Vi, because it was not Vi was an educator. See, the women back then, Johnny, this was education. This wasn't about win. You wanted to win, of course. Yeah. They were educators. They came out of the background of physical education. They didn't come out of the background of athletics, because they didn't play athletics.
Right.
They came as educators, and that's what Vi and Mary Jo Herdman were.
That mixture of mentors for you, just
Oh,
tremendous, right?
really was, it made the difference in my career.
Well, it could go the other way, right? You could,
Sure. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about at what point did you go to be athletic? Did they ask you?
They asked me.
How did it?
Back then, you know, even at the college in terms of just the athletics. So Phil Roach leaves. He went on to Guilford.
What year?
1989.
Okay.
And at that time, we had our first ever provost, Gwen Jensen, and she contacted me, and Patrick McDonough was the president.
Mm-hmm.
And Gwen called me and said, Debbie, we want you to be the athletics director. I mean, I was the assistant athletics director, and I had duties over women's sports. I said, oh my God, Gwen, I can't be the athletic director. I mean, no, you'll do great. She took me to the Lafayette Hotel over a beer and said, we need you, you've got to be the athletic director. We really need you. It's probably because they didn't want to do a search. Oh, President McDonough supports it. We want you to be the athletic. I said, all right. I mean, I'll give it a good try. And that was in 1989. And I stayed the athletic director till 2007.
Wow.
And it was a huge learning curve. Huge learning curve.
The support group of, I don't know, individual. I always think of Jim Meagle, or businesses, or specific people and or businesses along the way, probably pretty instrumental in kind of raising the bar.
Not early on, because it scared me, honestly. I was a woman. You go to an OAC meeting in 1989 and look around the table.
Yeah.
It's Larry Karras.
Yeah.
It's, John Carroll hadn't even entered yet. But so I was sitting back a little bit. I didn't know yet what I needed to start to learn. But I was fortunate to have a Jim Meagle, who had been in leadership positions, right? It's not even just about athletics. It's how do you now take charge of a 30-person department?
Right. And find other people to be cheerleaders
and find other
for you.
people to buy, and then I had to develop my own personal philosophy. That was the hardest part. I didn't have a philosophy to make decisions based on, so I had to start developing that. So I learned from other people. Instead of pushing people sort of at a distance, I embraced them, which Coach Shawley was important to do that, because I became Coach Shawley's boss. And not a peer anymore. I'm now his boss.
Right.
And that takes on a very different role. So I decided I needed to learn. And I cited this in my Hall of Fame remarks about I needed to learn from him. And it could be difficult, though we all know that could be difficult to do.
Yeah, I did the same. I was in the same
You were
train.
the same, right. And I decided to learn from the Larry Karrases and the gentleman up at Ohio Northern. I know all those names, when I was the only woman in any of these places. And they looked, and I was younger, certainly wasn't an older, experienced person. So they looked at you like, so what do you know?
Yeah, Dr. Bob Fisher, was that one?
Bob Fisher. But he wasn't the AD. He was the basketball coach, the longtime basketball coach.
Sure.
Over time, we all became friends and colleagues, and I took on leadership roles in the OAC and all that. But the transition from getting there was a big learning curve.
Easy to give up coaching, or no?
Yeah, well, we had to make a decision after I did it for a few years.
Yeah.
I was either going to be an AD or a coach.
Right.
You couldn't do both and have success.
Right.
So the college allowed me to become a full-time athletics director in 1991. So I really, in my entire career, I only coached 11 years.
Right.
In my career, counting Illinois and Marietta, was 40 years. So I really didn't coach as much as I served as an administrator.
As we close out the program, and as it relates to Title IX, and we talked about the political climate, when you think about Watergate in 1972, and then you think about the way the political climate is now, we always say now, well, you just know more, you just hear more. It's the same as it was, but it's kind of crazy that it was that way back then, right?
Yes.
And then title, we're talking about equality still at many different levels, but as it relates to Title IX, where did you see the jumps? Because you got in and you're like, oh boy, now you're here, and like they don't even know about it yet, right?
Right.
And so,
No.
where did if there were leaps?
Yeah,
or-
Tom asked me that, and I reflected on it. I think where we really took the step was when the women came under the governance of the NCAA and the Ohio Athletic Conference. But a lot of people don't realize the women were not we weren't governed. When I came here and when I started my career, we were governed by an organization called the AIAW. And we had no conference. We traveled everywhere. We'd play whoever would play us. In 1985, and that's when the conference looked at splitting. And they split because of gender equity. That was their excuse.
Right.
They didn't believe the Ohio Athletic Conference was giving its due to women's sports. And they were bringing the women on board. So when that finally happened, and we had secret
What was the
meetings,
year again?
1985, we had
85, yeah.
secret meetings with the old guard of women in the conference,
Right.
Lisa. They were bringing us in hotel rooms and pounding fists and saying,
Yeah.
we can't let the men take over. And I'm
Right.
just sitting there like, oh my gosh,
What's
what are
going
we
on?
getting into? But when that actually all transpired, NCAA comes in, takes over women's athletics. We now join a conference. We now have a conference. We now have a schedule. We now have goals, right? We can set up goals. And then we had a standard to start looking at. That was when I think we really started to take a turn because now people could relate their vocabulary to the women. How many people know about the AIAW?
Right.
Who's taught, but NCAA, because that's what the men do. So you always had to look to the men to create the standard. Now that's changed, but back then you got stuck with the standards the men
Right.
had.
Yeah.
And then over time that evolved to create your own, in a sense, identity and all of that. But that's when in my mind, for me, that's when we started to take a turn, because then I could say, well, we have to have a recruiting brochure too, because we didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
Just like baseball or football or
Sure.
whomever, we need to have a recruiting brochure too. We need to have a statistician.
Yeah.
We need to have a microphone at the game.
Yeah. So last thought, as it relates to identity, since you brought that up, you've got to feel pretty proud, sometimes tough to talk about, but contributions that you've made to, not just college, but community, to gender equality. There's a lot of things that you can roll out there and not think, well, gosh, yeah, I guess I did make a difference.
Yeah, I finished my career as a traditional faculty member in sports management.
Oh, yeah.
The last 5 years, so I taught all of this. And I used to tell them, for me, Title IX, I always knew it was in the back of my mind. It's part of your checklist as an administrator. Mm-hmm. I said, I never waved the flag. I never pounded the fist.
Right.
Because in my mind, Title IX is about doing what is right. And you as a manager or an administrator, if you always keep that in mind, but you have the law if you can't get it right in a reasonable period of time. So as I reflect back, I think we made huge steps, and I hope that I will always keep, even in my life, because I'm on different boards and organizations now, I do volunteer work, that I keep that in the back of my mind.
All right. Credit the approach for the success. That sounds like it was fantastic. Thank you for your time. Always
you're
a joy.
welcome.
Always love it.
Always, Johnny.
All right. Thank you very much. Debbie
Always,
Lazorik, our
always.
guest, as we celebrate Title IX and this 50th anniversary.